Hello students, I am Suman. Today we will discuss class 9 physics, lesson 2 force and law of motion. As you have already studied about force in your previous class, what is force, kinds of force and the effects of force. So here in this chapter we will also study the force, kinds of force, effects of force and some laws of motion which is given by the Newtons. So as you know that what is force? Force is a physical quantity which help us to change the state of rest or motion of the object, shape and size and direction. These are the force. It means if in definition, pull or push is a force which is tends to change its state of rest to motion or shape and size and direction. Simply we can write push or pull as a force. And there are different kinds of force. So the kinds of force, actually there are two kinds of force. One is contact force and second is non-contact force. Contact force and non-contact force. What is contact force? Contact force means when two body exert a force physically, then the force is contact force. Suppose that if you're lifting a carry bags, pushing a car, kicking a football, so these kinds of force is contact force, because in this force we and the objects are direct physical contact, and these contact force are different kinds, like frictional force and muscular force. Frictional force means when two object the direct physical contact. Suppose that an object which is on the surface of the ground, if you want to push or pull this object, the surface of the object and the surface on the ground, these two faces directly contact to each other, and in this section whatever force applied, the force is known as frictional force. Second direct contact force is muscular force. Muscular force means the force which is done by our muscles, like human muscles or animal muscles. Human muscles pulling a car, paddling a bicycle, lifting a carry bag, pushing a car. So these kinds of force which is exerted by human being, and this force is known as the muscular force. Other pulling a bullock cart by animals. So these are the examples of the frictional muscular force. Other force is non-contact force. Non-contact force means when the force exerted between two objects without any physical contact. This kinds of force is known as non-contact force, and there are several kinds of non-contact force. It is magnetic force, gravitational force and electrostatic force. Kinds of non-contact force, it is a magnetic force. Magnetic force. Actually, magnetic force is a non-contact force because magnet exert a force on the magnetic substance without any contact. Suppose that if you take a magnet and we'll put magnetic substance like iron nail. So there is no contact between this iron nail and the magnet, but the iron nail is attracted by this magnet. So this force is magnetic force, and this force is category of non-contact force. Other is gravitational force. Gravitational force also a kind of non-contact force, because if we leave any object from any height, the object will fall towards the earth, while there is no contact between the object and the earth. So the force which is exerted by the earth on the object without any contact is known as the gravitational force. And third is electrostatic force. Electrostatic force. Electrostatic force means the force which is created by or generated by the electricity. We'll take a comb and we'll rub with our dry hair, and when we'll put some pieces of paper, we'll see the pieces of paper will attracted by the comb, while there is no contact between pieces of paper and the comb. So this force is electrostatic force, and it is examples or the part of non-contact force. Now, apart from this force, there are some forces, and these forces are balanced and unbalanced force. Balanced force, balanced force. What is balanced force? Suppose that any object, and if we apply a force on this object with the same quantity, the object, and we apply force on this object 10 Newton from this side and 10 Newton from this side. So here the resulting force whatever exert on the object is 0. So if the resulting force on the object is 0, the force is known as balanced force, and simply the unbalanced force. Unbalanced force. In this case, if several force applied on the object and the resultant force is non-zero, suppose that you are at 100 Newton force and this side 10 Newton. So both the force exert on the object in opposite direction and the resultant force is not zero. So this kinds of force is unbalanced force. And there are some effects of force. So what are the effects of force? So force can change the state of rest or motion of the object. State of rest means suppose that an object is moving on the ground, and the force which is exerted between the object and the ground, which is the frictional force. Due to this frictional force, object will stop after some time. So due to the frictional force, the object will stop, and this is the effects of force. So force can change the rest of state or motion of the object. And suppose that if some object is at rest, and if you apply the force on that object, the object will come on motion. Next effects of the force is force can change the shape and size of the object. Suppose that you take a balloon, flat balloon, and if you squeeze it, we'll see the shape of the balloons become different size. So the balloon becomes different size due to the force when we exert on this balloon. Force can also change the direction of the object. How the force can change the direction? So cricket player throw a ball and the batsman hits this ball in the other direction. So here the force also can change the direction of the object. So these are some effects of the force. Now whatever you have been studied in previous class 8. Now here we see the law of motion. There are three laws of motion which is given by Newton's, and this law of motion is known as first law of motion, second law of motion, and third law of motion. Laws of motion. There are three laws of motion, and this law of motion is given by the Newton's. That's why it's known Newton's. It is known as Newton's first law of motion. Number 2, Newton's second law of motion, and third is Newton's third law of motion. Newton's first law of motion, Newton's second law of motion, then third law of motion. Newton's first law of motion, what? I told you Newton about this law. If the object is at rest, it will remain at rest. If the object if the object is in motion, it will remain in motion unless an external force applied on it. This is the Newton's first law of motion. Newton's second law of motion. In this motion, Newton told the rate of change of velocity is directly proportional to the force applied on the object. It means when we apply a force on the object, their velocity gradually increases at the same rate. And Newton's third law of motion, every action and reaction is equal in opposite direction. So these are the three laws of motion, and this law of motion we will discuss in detail in your next class. Till then, thank you.